Coming to you live from Radio Cayman Studio.
For the record.
For the record. Hear from your government officials, independents, and the opposition on issues that matter to you. The record. Engage in an open dialogue between residents and lawmakers.
For the record.
The record. Informative, impartial, insightful.
This is your talk show.
1-800-534-8255. Your calls, your input. This is For the Record. And now, your host, Orit Connor.
Good morning and welcome to For the Record, where I'm your host, Orit Connor. Today is Monday, the 13th of April, 2015. For all of you superstitious persons, it's the 13th, but it's not Friday the 13th. But if you're really, really superstitious, no matter what day the 13th falls on, you may feel some way about it. But what I say to you is go about your normal way of life and just forget about it. Think of it as any other normal day. So I want to welcome you, whether you're here in the Cayman Islands or if you're following us overseas via the web. Of course, For the Record is a show produced by the staff and management of Radio Cayman, and it is designed specifically for you. It is designed to keep you abreast of issues as they arise and play out on the local, regional, and international scene. I am your host, of course, Orit Connor. Some people call me OC. Some people call me other things, which we won't mention on the radio here. But you're welcome to join me every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 7:30 a.m. until 9:30 a.m. Our phone lines are always open, and there is always someone there waiting to take your calls. We don't have a time limit on how long you speak, but we ask you to be conscious of the fact that there is usually someone else waiting on the line to speak as well. So we ask you to make your comments or your questions as brief as possible, thus giving our guests an opportunity to give you a satisfactory answer. Our phone lines, like I said, are open. We have a toll-free number, which is 1-800-534-8255. You can also call us on 949-8037 or 949-6990. And of course, if you don't like to talk on the telephone, then you can email us at For the Record. That is one word, For the Record, at candw.ky. I also want to remind you that For the Record is brought to you by LED Lighting, Engineering, and Design. They're located on Dorsey Drive in the Industrial Park. They have wonderful equipment, devices in there, accessories that will help you save on your energy bills. And like I said, if you want to have a low electrical bill like Miss Georgette says she has, then maybe you want to check out Lighting, Engineering, and Design and see what they can do for you. This morning we're pleased to have in the studio with us the Honorable Tara Rivers, who is the Minister responsible for Education, Employment, and Gender Affairs. We're also pleased to have Mr. Lemuel Hurlston, who's the Chair of the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee. We also have Ms. Tammy Ebanks, who is the Acting Deputy Chief Officer, in the Ministry of Employment, Education, Employment, Gender Affairs. And she's also been the liaison between the ministry and the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee. We also expect to have the Honorable Alden McLaughlin, Premier of the Cayman Islands, join us later on as well. But this morning we're going to be talking about the much anticipated report of the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee, and we're going to ensure that this morning is not overshadowed by Hillary Clinton's announcement for presidency or Marco Rubio's pending announcement this morning. We will not be overshadowed by those things, because in the Cayman Islands, what the people have been anticipating is the report of the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee. We have it, and we have the experts here to explain it to us this morning and to field your questions as well. So I want to welcome all of our guests, and I'll start with Minister Rivers. Minister, good morning, and welcome back again to For the Record.
Good morning, OC, and good morning to the listening and watching public. Thank you for having us once again.
Certainly. And Mr. Hurlston, if you don't mind, I'll go with the ladies first. Ms. Ebanks, Tam Ebanks.
Good morning. Thank you for having us.
And welcome to For the Record. And of course, Mr. Hurlston, a former boss of mine, as well. Good morning and welcome to For the Record.
Good morning.
Well, folks, it's like I said, it's good to have you here. We know that some discussion has already ensued in relation to the minimum wage advisory committee's report. We saw and heard the press briefing that took place last week as well in this regard. So far, it appears as if the reviews coming forward on the report seem to be favorable. Like I said, much anticipated, and it appears as if, due to the makeup of the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee, that you got a broad spectrum in terms of the inputs that were received.
Yes, Mr. Connor, the makeup of the committee, and we'll start with that since you brought that up. It was a strategic discussion and strategic decision to actually appoint the committee that covered also and the input of employers as well as employees and independent stakeholders, which were which represented industries and viewpoints that were key to this. So we had a legal advisor on the committee. We had Mr. Lemuel Hurlston, who acted as chair, who also was in the independent capacity. So there wouldn't be any idea of bias towards any individual group, employer versus employees. The employer representation, obviously, we had the members of the Chamber of Commerce as well as other key industry or employer groups such as the Contractors Association and CETA and the like. For the employees, we had to be a bit more creative because we don't have a history of a strong labor movement here in the Cayman Islands. We don't have actual labor unions that represent the interests of employees per se in the private sector. That is, so we look to identify other stakeholders through the civic and community organizations. We also had a representative of the Business and Professional Women's Club because it was important to make sure that we had the gender perspective represented, not only in the form of that particular rep, but we were very conscious to make sure when we appointed the committee that the committee was gender balanced. So we had that perspective, and importantly, we also made sure we appointed young people who are most affected in some instances with respect to employment and the issues and concerns as it relates to unemployment as well. So we wanted to make sure we had both a gender balanced as well as age balanced, to put it that way, to ensure that we had a really robust group of people working on this committee, on this report. So from that perspective, then of course the guidance provided by the ILO was very instrumental as well, because of course this was following the International Labour Organization's kind of internationally accepted methodology and framework for establishing a minimum wage. And so really, I think it's important at this point to really pause and take stock about where we're at today. Mr. Connor, we have created history. We have made history in this country with just the process of actually getting to this point, of having a well thought out, a well researched, a well analyzed and deliberated report that speaks for itself in large degree. It is an advisory report of the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee, but what it has done is it has allowed us as a country to now have an informed discussion, and for the government to take an informed decision about what the implications and how the implementation of a national minimum wage regime should look. And again, it's based on qualitative, quantitative, and statistical and economic analysis, which up until this point we did not have. We've had numerous discussions on this point, as you know, over the years. Many motions passed, and nothing more than just that promises made by various governments. Most recently, up until 2011, the past government made a commitment in the House by passing a motion to accept a $5 minimum wage. But as you can see, nothing beyond just the promise of doing something about the issue. So really, this is the first time that any government, and I would hearken to say at this point, it took a coalition government to achieve what we've achieved today, in that, you know, myself as the independent member of cabinet and minister responsible for labor worked very closely with the government as a whole to ensure that we could actually move this process forward in a timely manner, in a manner that produced something that we all can be proud of. Whether or not people accept or reject what the recommendation is, that is everybody's democratic right. But what can't be rejected is the thought process and the analysis and the research that was conducted. Now we have, as I said, a document that gives us some sort of a blueprint for what would need to happen in order to make a national minimum wage regime implementable and enforceable as well, because the committee was tasked to look at a number of factors, including how do we actually make this thing work once we get to that stage.
Okay. One of my early observations and comments on For the Record was when you looked at the representation on there, and like you said, getting representation based from the workers was difficult because you don't have any organized organization for workers here in the Cayman Islands. Was the absence of let's say those at the lowest strata in the workforce, the domestic workers, the gardeners. We didn't see names that represented them on there per se. But I would imagine, Mr. Hurlston, that at the same time that there was a lot of anecdotal evidence that came out in your during your deliberations in relation to some of the conditions that workers find themselves, you know, under. Because when you look at the minimum wage and the recommendation that is made, it is representing the laborers, the domestic helpers. Those are the ones that are mainly affected, you know, by this. Of course, the employers will argue, well, we're the ones that are really affected because we're the ones who have to pay out at the end of the day. And when you look at the big picture, we're all involved in this because, you know, at the end of the day, we all pay. If we're consumers, if the grocery stores, the supermarkets have to raise their prices because of an increase in salaries, then we, the general public, end up paying, you know, as well.
Sure. Well, we had to acknowledge at the very beginning, OC, that the terms of reference required us to look at addressing exploitation and trying to bring relief to the lowest paid workers in the country. And we had to acknowledge also that in reality the lowest paid in the case of Cayman are oftentimes non-Caymanians. So the first question that was asked in the committee is, who is likely to benefit the most? And should we begin to discriminate and show a different attitude towards non-Caymanians versus Caymanians? And the committee took the view that this was a social responsibility that we had to discharge to everyone, be they Caymanian or non-Caymanian. It was not an exercise in creating any more disunity. Rather, it was an exercise to level the playing field, and whoever happened to fall in that lower income category, then so be it. So the approach was really was taken without any bias or any discrimination whatsoever. And we did recognize early on that the non-Caymanian sector of our population would be the greater proportion of beneficiaries.
And sorry if I could just
Sure,
add to
go
that
right
as
ahead,
well.
Tammy,
You
yes.
had mentioned that you didn't see any makeup of it, and that's why we specifically did focus groups. So that was one of the ways that we did public consultation, and we had focus groups with those who are one of the lower paid sectors. We had focus groups with household employees. We had focus groups sessions with household employers, business employees, business employers. So from that, we got qualitative data that did give us a better picture of the experiences that low-paid workers were having, and we did find exploitation, and we did find high levels of contractual breaches. So that's how we kind of gathered that data. While there wasn't representation on the committee, that's how we got that data.
Excellent. Folks, I want to remind you that you're listening to For the Record. I'm your host, Art Connor. My guest in the studio with me this morning, we have the Honorable Tara Rivers, Minister responsible for Education, Employment, and Gender Affairs. We have Mr. Lemuel Hurlstone, who's the chair of the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee, and we also have with us Ms. Tammy Ebanks, who is the acting deputy chief officer in the ministry and also was the ministry's liaison with the advisory committee. When we come back from the break, I'm going to ask Mr. Hurlstone about the advantage of having a representative of the International Labour Organization on his committee. Please stay tuned. We will be back shortly. Good morning and welcome back to For the Record, where we're discussing the report of the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee. And here discussing that report with us, we have the Honorable Tara Rivers, Minister responsible for Education, Employment, and Gender Affairs. We also have the chair of the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee, Mr. Lemuel Hurlstone, and we have the liaison officer in the ministry with the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee, the acting deputy chief officer, Ms. Tammy Ebanks. Minister, obviously a lot of thought seemed to have gone into the selection, of the members of the advisory committee. Tell us how you managed to do that.
As I said, Mr. Connor, the decision to pull together a committee, and I know initially, there was lots of reactions about, the best way to kill a project is to send it to a committee. But I think, we have obviously proven the critics wrong in that regard. The committee, as Mr. Hurlstone said, was tasked with very extensive terms of reference, issues that they were expected to consider and did consider and make recommendations on, of course, thereafter. But also, so it would be really remiss of me not to publicly thank and acknowledge all of the hard work that the committee has actually carried out in fulfilling to the best of their ability the terms of reference which the government has set for them. And I want to publicly thank the chair of the committee and all the members of the committee, including the technical advisors provided as ex officio members as well from the various government departments. But I'd also like to thank sincerely the very hard work of the members of the Ministry of Education, Employment and Gender Affairs, and in particular Ms. Tammy Ebanks and the team in the ministry that acted as a secretariat to the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee throughout the entire process, and really worked hard towards the end, especially to pull together the report within the time frame. And I must say that the committee did live within the original time frame set by Cabinet, which was by the end of February. And so again, that is a testament to when you have the right people working together and who are committed to carrying out their responsibility, that we actually can see the results that we expect. And as I said, it's now up for the government as a whole, the ministry, through the work of the Secretariat and the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee. Obviously, we have done what we need to do in order to get us to this point. And as Minister, as I said, I'm very happy to be a part of this process and to be a part of a government that is committed to working towards addressing the needs of our people. And as I alluded to before, coalition governments can work if you elect the right people who have the best interests of the country at heart, who are willing and committed to working together. This is a prime example of that. So again, the selection was very strategic in terms of the skill sets that we know we needed to have represented on the committee, the perspectives we needed to have come to the table and in the discussions. And as we've heard in a number of forums before, the discussions, I think, got quite heated on certain issues, and that's to be expected because these are complicated questions that they were tasked to answer. And in particular, just to give an example, and the terms of reference is found, the full terms of reference is found in the actual report itself. But the committee was asked to the question whether or not there should be one basic minimum wage or separate minimum wages based on industry and other economic sector differentiation. They were asked to determine whether or not the minimum wage should be established according to age and whether special considerations should be given to any differentiation needed for young people. Some countries we see have an age differentiated minimum wage regime, so we wanted to know whether or not that was most appropriate for our environment here as well. They were also asked whether or not the differentiated minimum wages should be established for Caymanians versus non-Caymanians, and as we've heard from the chair, they took that perspective into consideration and they made their recommendation accordingly. And also, they were asked, as an example, to consider whether appropriate pay components such as gratuities and in-kind payments, such as housing, food, etc., should be used in calculating the minimum wage, and whether or not a minimum wage should apply to non-governmental, non-profit, and charitable organizations, as well as the wider community. So those are just some examples of the types of questions and the types of deliberations, and more importantly, the information that they needed to get. And so it was absolutely critical that we enlisted the help of a technical advisor, and in the end, the ministry and myself, I wrote to the ILO and asked for their assistance, and they were very graciously provided their technical assistant or technical advisory in a almost free capacity, in the sense that we only had to cover the costs of the mission trip, so to speak, of that advisor coming, but all the work was provided free of charge. So that really caused us to be able to have incredible savings and in the amount of money that we actually had to spend on this process. And so we're very grateful for the help of the ILO in this regard as well. And but I will certainly leave the committee to talk to how important that role of the technical advisor played.
Certainly, because when we look at the insurance industry, when we look at pensions, you have the advantage of having actuaries, work with you. How close does the ILO advisor come to being similar to an actuary?
Very close. We began by acknowledging that the Cayman Islands had a considerable body of data in the form of various reports and statistical sources, but what we didn't have was a history and the experience and wisdom of how to interpret that data, how to evaluate it and put it into the correct context. And that is where we had to rely on the ILO consultant. He was a labor specialist and he had considerable experience. He was a native of Suriname, and he had actually been a minister in the government of Suriname, so he had some political experience at the policy making level. But he had spent many years doing analysis and consulting work for various governments around the region. And so he came to us with the right sort of background, that he could take the data that we supplied him with, he could put it into the correct interpretation, and then he could regurgitate that in a sort of an impartial way as to how it related to the labor policies and to the labor market and to the economy of Cayman. So his report really gave us the basis of understanding what our economy was telling us, some of which we guessed and we had sort of predicted and thought that we knew, but his independent assessment of it gave us the assurance that we were not just dreaming, but that we were basing it on some reality.
Okay, folks, I want to remind you that you're listening to For the Record. I'm your host, Orit Connor. My guest in the studio with me this morning discussing the report of the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee. We have the Honorable Tara Rivers, Minister responsible for Education, Employment, and Gender Affairs. We also have Mr. Lemuel Hurlston, who's the chair of the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee, and we also have the acting Deputy Chief Officer in the ministry, Ms. Tammy Ebanks, who was also the liaison between the ministry and the advisory committee. We're going to go to the news now. Please stay tuned, because when we come back, we will be discussing more in depth the report of the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee. Good morning and welcome back to For the Record. I'm your host, Orrit Connor. I am also happy to have in the studio with us the Honorable Premier, Honorable Alden McLaughlin. We have Honorable Tara Rivers, Minister responsible for Education, Employment and Gender Affairs. We have Mr. Lemuel Hurlston, the Chair of the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee. And we also have Ms. Tammy Ebanks, who's the Acting Deputy Chief Officer in the Ministry and who has also been the liaison between the Ministry and the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee. And of course, we're discussing the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee's report. Everyone has focused mainly on the fact that the recommendation of a gross minimum wage of $6. Before I go back to our guests, I just want to make an observation as far as the Cayman Islands are concerned. We see some of the Middle Eastern countries, the oil-rich ones as well, where they rely on a lot of foreign labor. They rely on domestic helpers to ostensibly take care of their homes and their children. And we have seen I've seen in numerous publications horror stories of people being exploited there, their passports being held, they're not getting the wages, sometimes even physically abused. We saw in the Cayman Islands a few years ago where there was concern from the Filipino authorities in relation to the way that their nationals were perceived to be treated, in the Cayman Islands. And as a result of that, they insisted on signed contracts, binding contracts between employers and employees. And in many instances, they did not allow their nationals to travel to work in the Cayman Islands unless those contracts were actually in place. So with the recommendation of the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee and with the establishment of a minimum wage, it would appear to me that it puts the Cayman Islands on a proper footing from a from an international perspective, as coming in line and being compliant in terms of the way that our foreign workers are treated. Premier, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, well, one of my great concerns over many years really has been about the way that we treat the most vulnerable in this community. And unfortunately, there is an attitude, and the attitude is still very much around, that because someone comes from another place where the standard of living is not what it is in Cayman, that therefore they ought to feel fortunate to be here, and that we can treat them however we like. That has always been so offensive to me and to the way I perceive we should treat everyone. We're all human beings, and I am incredibly proud of where we've actually reached, even though we haven't actually implemented a minimum wage now, but that we've had this report, which has been very carefully done and has been prepared on the basis of a lot of research and consultation, and that we are now acknowledging as a country that we have within our midst employers who are treating and continue to treat people in an inhumane way. And I am glad to be part of a government that is taking the first steps to deal with this inequity and, quite frankly, this shame.
Okay. I think we have one caller online, so we're going to take that caller now. Caller, good morning and welcome to For the Record.
Good morning, OC.
Good morning, Mr. Ivan. How are you?
All right.
Looked for you yesterday but didn't see you. You must have had a hangover.
No. 40 years I didn't have one then.
That's good.
I don't know exactly who else you got on panel, but I know Mr. Rivers is there.
And we have Mr. Lemuel Hurston, who's the chair of the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee. We also have the Premier, and we have Ms. Tammy Ebanks, who is the acting Deputy Chief Officer in the ministry.
Well, I want to tell you all good morning.
Morning, sir.
Morning.
And I would say, one of the popular saying from one politician, you came a long ways, baby.
Virginia Slims commercial, huh?
That been knocked around for a long time, and I am proud that you got it this far, and hopefully the cabinet will pass it all the way. There's something been knocked around for a long, long time, and we do need it, but people don't realize how complicated it was to get it or put it this far. And I'm very discouraged at the turnout of the meetings that you all been having. Mr. Hunston was doing an excellent job in all the committee, but I am surprised, I'm disappointed with the public that makes so much noise about it, and when they got a chance to have an input in it, they keep quiet, but they rather get on the talk show and talk about it. So I want to praise you all for putting it this far, and some people was worried about if you put it $6 and if they pay $9 now, they can put it down. No, I don't think an employer should be that heartless to put it down. That is a base that you can't pay no less than that.
Yeah,
Right,
and Mr.
exactly.
Ivan, that is something that we're going to ask our panelists here in terms of when the legislation is brought into effect, will it ensure that it grandfathers in those persons who are already at a higher wage?
Yeah, so I got get chance listening a little bit now before the buses come, so I want to praise you all for doing a good job.
Thank you very
Thank
much,
you,
Mr.
Mr.
Ivan.
Ivan.
Thank you. We have another caller, but we want to take this caller and then we can answer Mr. Ivan, and if this caller has questions as well. Caller, good morning. Welcome to For the Record.
Good morning, folks. This is Kenneth Frank speaking. Good morning, OC. Good morning, panel.
Morning, Kenneth. How are you?
Morning.
Morning.
Good morning. Good morning, Premier. I have a question. I noticed that there's a trend happening here in regards to response to this minimum wage amount, in regards to exploitation of workers, and it almost seems that there's an attitude toward that this number has been reached to stop the exploitation of workers. Obviously, we all can admit that there's some employers out there who take advantage of people with a very small pay, $3, $4 an hour, that we've agreed that is not really good for you to have a good life in the Cayman Islands at that amount of money. But I'm concerned that we didn't reach a number that actually helps Caymanians. Wasn't the outcome and the goal of this committee to find a wage to deal with Caymanians' livings and how Caymanians are going to survive on a minimum wage? It sounds like this is all about the expatriate workers rather than the Caymanians. What number do you think Caymanians can survive on? Because I think we all can agree that Caymanian standard of living and many of the expat workers who come here standards of living may be different, and actually a rather large difference, because as the Premier has admitted in the press conference, you have situations where you may have 5 and 6 people all in one room, when the average Caymanian wouldn't appreciate that and doesn't want that to be their standard of life. So basically my question is, I'm hoping that this number is not to prevent exploitation of workers, but to actually bring up the standard of living for Caymanians. Maybe you guys can comment on that for me.
Thank you very much, Kenneth, for that.
Well,
Minister, Premier.
Yeah, well, let me say to start with, what Kenneth has identified really is the confusion which exists in the minds of many about what this exercise is actually aimed at doing. It is about fixing a minimum wage. That is the minimum amount for which anyone can be lawfully employed in the Cayman Islands. That is separate and distinct from a living wage, which is generally not fixable by legislation. At the moment, there is no minimum wage. You can pay a person whatever it is that they are prepared to accept to work for. And that is what this exercise is about fixing. But the other bit that I need Kenneth to appreciate is that if he reads the report, he will see that about 25% of the persons who are this is expected to impact positively in terms of employees are actually Caymanian. It isn't just the expatriate employee who is earning, basement rates. A minimum wage in any country is just that, the minimum wage for which anyone can be employed. It does not represent what is necessarily the market rate or a living wage. Cayman has nothing in terms of minimum wage legislation at the moment. We have to start somewhere. I have learned, I had nothing to do with what the number that the committee has come up with, and no doubt they will speak to their thought process and methodology in arriving at this particular sum. But I say this with the benefit of some 15 years in politics. I've learned the hard way that if you try to do too much at once, too quickly, you often wind up with nothing. And if we pitch the minimum wage too high, regardless of what the recommendations say, the pushback that we are going to receive from the business community and the overall impact on the cost of living, because understand and believe that this is going to be passed on to the consumer, because very few employers and businesses are going to accept a reduction in their profit margin as a result of this exercise. And if we pitch the figure not at 6 but at 8 or 9, as some people have suggested to me, the knock-on effect from an economic standpoint is going to be quite significant. We've got to start somewhere. And my own view, we haven't sorted this out in caucus yet, but my own view is that we should accept the recommendations of the committee as a starting point. They've said that their recommendations are only good for a year and will be subject to review thereafter. And I think that's the way we need to go about it. Decide on when the implementation date should be, start with a minimum wage of $6 and take it from there. Already there is significant pushback from some in the hospitality industry, despite the extensive consultation that was had with them. If you look at the front page of the Compass today, you will see, and the story which goes over to the inside, you'll see that Mark Langevin, I think his name is, who is the general manager there, is objecting to having to pay $4.50 an hour, which is what will apply to the hospitality industry, because where there is a gratuity involved, they can knock off $1.50 off the $6. So if you're getting pushback from the hospitality industry at $4.50 an hour, can you imagine what it'll be if we were to try to start this at $8 or $9 an hour? It will never happen.
Okay, we're going to go to a commercial break now, and then when we come back, we also want to respond to Mr. Ivan's question in relation to will it affect those persons who are already making more. Folks, please stay tuned. You're listening to For the Record. I'm your host, Orrit Connor. My guest in the studio with me this morning, we have the Premier, Honorable Alden McLaughlin. We have Minister Tara Rivers. We have Mr. Lemuel Hurlston, who's the chair of the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee. And we also have Ms. Tammy Ebanks, who is the acting deputy chief officer and also the liaison, the ministry's liaison with the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee. Please stay tuned. We will be back shortly. Good morning and welcome back to For the Record, where I am your host, Orrit Connor, and my guest in the studio with me this morning, we have the Honorable Premier, Honorable Alden McLaughlin. We have Honorable Tara Rivers, Minister responsible for Education, Employment and Gender Affairs. We also have Mr. Lemuel Hurlston, who's the chair of the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee, and Ms. Tammy Ebanks, who is the acting deputy chief officer in the ministry as well, as serving as the liaison between the ministry and the advisory committee. Before we went to the break, we had two calls. Mr. Ivan was said that there was some concern as to whether or not those persons who are currently making more than the recommended minimum wage, if and when this legislation comes into being, how will it affect them? Minister Rivers?
Yes, thank you. Before I actually go to that, I just wanted to also weigh in on the last caller and the comments made about how is this not or a wage that would be impacting Caymanians. And as the Premier said, the report does actually indicate that this impacts all persons, or would impact, I would say, once the government does move forward with implementing a minimum wage. Any minimum wage that is set by law would impact all employees, including Caymanians, and in this case, with the recommended figure being 6%, we see that it does include
$6.
Sorry, $6. Sorry, yes, $6. It would impact at least 25% of the Caymanian workforce in this very low wage and low wage brackets, and so also to the point about increasing costs, we have a figure that has been recommended, but they have gone on to actually quantify what those costs would be with respect to increasing in the consumer price index and otherwise. And so again, we know that at the rate that they have recommended, it would be minimal in terms of the increase projected cost to the consumer price index. And of course, I can get them to give more details and about the exact percentage. But also, I think one of the things that I know over the weekend, the concern has been expressed to me about increasing costs at the grocery store, or the cost of, the basic items when you go to purchase your groceries. But during the press conference, we heard from the Economics and Statistics Officer, who is also very much a part of this process, Mr. Adolphus Laidlaw. He pointed out that, actually, with respect to supermarkets, they already pay, by and large, above the recommended minimum wage. So the impact on prices at the supermarket level, so to speak, should be minimal, if anything, and it would only impact a few, I guess, of their employees who would be making below the rate that they pay. And I think that he gave a figure of somewhere around $7 an hour as being their average pay rate as well. So I think the country shouldn't have, again, at the recommended rate that the committee has put forward, with the kinds of analysis, with the information that they've been able to produce, the country shouldn't have too much concern about increasing prices at that particular wage recommendation. But of course, every increase that you would go up, so if the rate were to be $8, $9, $10, you would see a much larger increase on the CPI. You would see a much larger increase on the costs. And so the actual purpose of implementing a minimum wage would be counterproductive. Because if you're trying to improve people's lot in moving them beyond the poverty line, it is that balance of being able to do that without impacting the general cost of living to the extent possible. And I think, again, the report and the committee has done a very good job in trying to reach that balance. And of course, it is still ultimately a political decision to be made, but as minister who would be responsible for taking this forward once the government has made a decision about it, I certainly was not prepared to push forward with any recommendation of any rate without having the kind of information that we now have to be able to make an informed decision. So from that perspective, I think that the country has definitely come a very long way. And very briefly to Mr. Ivan's concern, again, this is a floor rate, or it would be a floor rate. The power of negotiation, the power of people being able to say, well, here is what I'm bringing to the table, so here is what I think is a fair wage, is certainly still there. This isn't the cap. This is the floor. This is what we're saying. You cannot pay, once this becomes law, you cannot pay anyone for their services any less than this legally mandated rate. Again, the goal and the ideal from my perspective is we would want to look at issues as it relates to cost of living. So we would want to think about, well, what does it mean for people to be able to live comfortably in this community? But at the same time, there are wants and there are needs. And that is, I think, another conversation that the country needs to have with respect to what does it mean I can't live on $6 an hour, because quite frankly, many people are living.
But
how
do we protect, how do we ensure that we protect those persons who are, say, making $7 or $8 an hour now, and an employer coming to in and saying, this is law now that the minimum that I have to pay you is $6 an hour. So I'm going to reduce your wage from $8 an hour or $9 an hour to $6 an hour. How do we prevent that other than by legislation?
Why would any employer do that? Now, without any protection at all in place, they are paying $7 or $8 an hour when they could pay $2 or $3, arguably. But the reason they're not paying 2 or 3 is that nobody's going to work for it at 2 or 3. I really don't see that as a great challenge, and I believe if employers were to try that, what they'd find is people would migrate away, because if those people
but then they were able to bring people back in on $6 an hour. Wouldn't we want to ensure that there's some grandfather clause in there that prevents that from happening?
But isn't it it would be a contractual breach, basically, in my opinion, whether it was written or oral, it would be a contractual breach between the employer and employee. So that's, something I can't see employers doing that.
Or when the contract comes up for renewal, then you say it's going to go down to $6 an hour. There is that possibility, and we want to ensure that there are no unforeseen,
But if that's what the market will bear, that's what the market will bear. I mean, we have to be careful how much intervention we actually make in the economy, in telling employers. An employer has decided that whatever rate it is, at or above the minimum, this particular job is worth. And if there are employees who are prepared to work for that, then that's the way it is.
But I mean, I think by and large too, you'll see that the report talks to just specific industries that would be the greatest, will be impacted the greatest. And I think it would be helpful at this point to kind of hear from the committee about some of those industries. So the widespread fear of, now that we have an established minimum wage, it's going to affect every single industry and every single person. Well, actually, it won't. It will only affect those that are the most vulnerable in the community, that is currently living at or below poverty line, or the economic vulnerability thresholds established in the report, which is that of $5.22 per hour. So again, it won't, by and large, for the majority of the employees in the community, it won't have an impact, and they'll go on with their day-to-day life, and they won't see much of an impact in terms of prices. But for those that are living below poverty line, those that are struggling to make ends meet, and they have no legal protection to do so, this is where they will actually be able to have a significant impact in ensuring that there is that legal protection about services rendered.
Right. Can I just speak to what Minister Rivers talked about before as far as CPI?
Sure,
we looked at different scenarios, the committee did. We had analysis from the Economics and Statistics Office. And one of the scenarios, for instance, is what if 100% of the entire cost of business was passed through to consumers? We looked at what the impact would be on the Consumer Price Index, and it's estimated that would be 0.85%, which is obviously very, very minor. The strongest impact, it was expected to increase in housing and utilities at 0.28% and 0.13% increase in miscellaneous goods and services. So as Minister Rivers was talking before, the idea that supermarket prices would go up. Their average employees are being paid more than what the suggested minimum wage rate is now. So that scenario kind of wouldn't play out. Also, to speak a little bit about what the caller, Mr. Bryan, had talked about Caymanians and non-Caymanians. One of the things that the report suggested was that the definition of Caymanian and non-Caymanian is what our data, what the data that we had to look at, that's how everybody's broken down, Caymanian, non-Caymanian. So when you hear the term non-Caymanian, you automatically think migrant worker, but we know that that's not the case. We know that there are people who are in our community, who are tied to our community, who may not necessarily be classified as Caymanian, but who have long-term ties here, who may be, the spouse of a Caymanian, who may be permanent residents. So those are also classified as non-Caymanians in the current system of the data. Therefore, the data actually, more than likely, it's a good estimate to say that the people who we have identified as non-Caymanians being affected by it, there's actually persons who, while they're non-Caymanian, they have ties to Cayman. So they're not true migrant workers. So the impact, therefore, would affect Caymanian families as well, positively. That is actually one of the recommendations that the committee suggested as well, is in moving forward, we look at adding a third layer. So in identifying not just the pure migrant workers, but those who have ties permanently to Cayman, who are not necessarily technically Caymanian. The other thing, as far as Minister Rivers had mentioned, the 522 figure, and just to give the listening audience an idea of the industries that have the low-paying earners in there. There were 5 industries that were identified. It was wholesale and retail trade, repair of motor vehicles and motorcycles, restaurant and mobile food service activities, administration and support service activities. Those are your security guards. The activities of households as employers, and construction. So in that, in those 5 industries, there's very low wage earners and low wage earners. Those who are identified as very low wage earners were persons who earned $4.61 per hour, or less than that. And those who were identified as low wages earned $4.62 to $9.23 an hour. So what we had to do was to look at 3 things. It was the data that we had as far as what employees made. Also, we had to look at the business's ability to pay, and we had to look at a poverty line. And we, the committee, had determined basically a Cayman Islands economic vulnerability threshold, and that was $5.22 an hour. So that's where we agreed that the minimum wage should be set above a vulnerability threshold. So that was where the $6 an hour basically came from, because you have to identify what is your lowest industry's ability to pay this minimum wage. And from there we found that the lowest industry, including household employers, we felt that $6 was a comfortable figure to pay, that they still have the capacity to pay.
Okay, Mr. Hurlston, I'm a history buff, and I see here in the report, in the executive summary, that the Cayman Islands previously had a minimum wage law which was enacted in 1946. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I can tell you what the Hansards say about it. I was born in 1951, so I wasn't around. But nevertheless, the history is there. Remember, the Cayman Islands had a traditional form of parliamentary government going way back. And it is clear that our former legislators, the justices and vestry, I believe they were referred to in the early days, they had a sort of a consciousness about them that was truly Caymanian. And one of the earliest pieces of legislation that they would have turned their attention to would have been the question of economic fairness in their society. And I think that's where that early minimum wage would have come from. There's also some information in the archives about the earliest payments of poor relief that was authorized by the government back in the days when we had no Department of Children and Family Services, no social services. There was a law that prescribed how much the government was willing to pay persons who were deemed to be poor persons. And I can't tell you the figure offhand, but I researched it recently, and it was an extremely low figure. And of course it was in sterling, it was in pounds, shillings and pence. But it demonstrates that the country was always conscious of economic cost on its population, and therefore minimum wage is not new in conceptual terms. And the parliamentarians at that time were just as sensitive, if not more so, than the parliamentarians of today.
And just to add to Chairman Hurlston's perspective, having actually looked at the minimum wage law of 1946 and now superseded law, it's interesting because what was very striking about that law is it actually had essentially the same type of provision that our current labor law, labor law essentially of 1987, which has had a few amendments and tweaks to be the latest 2011 version. But in the minimum wage law of 1946, they actually had the ability for the administrator of the islands at the time to appoint what was considered advisory boards for the purpose of advising and assisting in the establishment of a minimum wage regime. So from way back in 46, as Chairman Hurlston said, they contemplated the role of having such a process of having boards or having mechanisms to advise the administrator as to what this wage should or shouldn't be. And again, that was kept in the 1987 law, except the names and language and references to governor and cabinet as opposed to administrator, and all of that changed. But essentially, the same mechanisms, the same process was there. But it really is worth reiterating that this is the first time, this is the first government that has actually taken what the law has allowed for over 50 years and actually taken it through to a process where we can actually have the advice, the sound advice provided by, in this instance, the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee, to be able to allow the government now to make a decision and take a decision which is prescribed by law. The law says that the government cannot put forward a minimum wage unless we've gone through this process. And that's something that could have happened many administrations ago, but it took this government, this administration, these players to be able to move it forward.
Okay, folks, I want to remind you that you're listening to For the Record. I'm your host, Orrit Connor, and my guest in the studio with me this morning, we have the Premier, Honorable Alden McLaughlin. We have Minister Tara Rivers, Honorable Tara Rivers. We also have Mr. Lemuel Hurlston, who's the chair of the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee, and we have Ms. Tammy Ebanks, who is the acting Deputy Chief Officer in the ministry, as well as being the ministry's liaison with the committee. Please stay tuned. We're going to take a short break, and then we will be back right after that. Good morning and welcome back to For the Record, where we're discussing the report of the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee. And in the studio with me this morning, we have, discussing this issue, we have the Premier, the Honorable Alden McLaughlin, we have Minister, the Honorable Tara Rivers, and we have Mr. Lemuel Hurlston, the chair of the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee, and we have the acting Deputy Chief Officer in the ministry, Ms. Tammy Ebanks. We have about a half an hour, a little bit more than a half an hour more to go, on this. We see now that we have a report, even though it was only unveiled last week, but based on the feedback so far that we have been receiving, either through talk shows or editorials or otherwise, it seems quite positive. Minister Rivers mentioned earlier about, having set up an advisory committee and gotten this far on it. How do we ensure that this effort, this genuine effort that has been made, and that the calls from the workers in general for the wages to be increased and for a minimum wage to come into effect, how do we ensure that this effort now does not go to waste like on previous occasions?
But let me say this, OC, at the start. If you look at the Progressives Manifesto, this is one of the key planks of our platform. When we formed the coalition government, not everybody was on board with respect to that. In fact, I remember some debates during the election campaign in which some of us had very different views. I've always believed, and that's how I've tried to run the government, in building consensus. And often the way to build consensus on an issue is for people to be persuaded by the facts. So when you just pluck a number out of the air, as the member from Northside did, and say, $5, on what basis do you say $5? What is the impact of that going to be? Is it going to help the employee? What is the impact going to be on prices, CPI, those sorts of things? How is it going to affect the economy? Those were legitimate concerns which members of the government team had. Having gone through this exercise, and for it to have been conducted in such a thorough, careful, well-researched way, we are now all armed with the facts and so informed we can make the key decisions that we need to make. I've very publicly expressed my view about my confidence in the report and its findings, and I don't see how I am better qualified than they are to make a judgment about what the number should be. I can't tell you that every member of my team is going to have that view because we haven't had that detailed discussion yet. we will in the next 2 weeks, next week and a couple of weeks to come. But I think the key decision that we have to make, more than the actual number, is when we actually implement this. I already have in my mind what I think the start date should be, but I'm not going to put that out there now because I haven't discussed that with my colleagues. But I'm saying all this to say to you is that we have a mandate. This administration has a mandate to implement a minimum wage, and I shall do my endeavor best to make sure that that occurs before the end of this term.
Minister Rivers, you want to add to that?
Yes, I certainly do, and I think, you know, obviously, as the Premier has acknowledged, that this really, the efforts of this government as a coalition government to get us to this point is historic for a number of reasons, because the PPM in their manifesto had this as a commitment. Now, myself as an independent member of the PPM-led coalition administration, I campaign very heavily on the idea of we need to address the idea of people having a livable wage in the country. Now, we have seen that the living wage is different than a minimum wage. However, the point, and I think this is probably where the kind of in between, people are living on what is being recommended as the minimum wage. They're not living very comfortably, but they are living. Otherwise, they wouldn't be here. We need to start. We need to start by putting a mechanism in place to ensure that people can survive in this economy and ultimately move towards a system where we are thriving. But again, we have to take a start, and we've debated this, we've discussed this, we've had the mechanism to do it for over 50 years. We are now at a point where we know the impact of what the impact on the economy would be. We've got a reasonably well thought out and recommended approach, and also rate, which we are much more comfortable as a government to be able to make a decision on. Yes, there will still be discussions, and I'm sure there will be deliberations amongst caucus about whether or not this is the rate or not. But from my perspective, again, we cannot, even talking about plucking a rate that or rates that's different than what is in this, we have to look at what the facts pertains. And so that was the biggest benefit, and also the fact that this report has illuminated so many other issues as it relates to labor. It has given me, as Minister of Labour, a much broader understanding of what some of these wider implications, wider labour issues that we need to look to addressing, not just from the perspective of a minimum wage, but more holistically from policies and programs. And also it gives reinforcement for some of the things that we know we had already attempted to do since taking office and moving that forward. So I think it's certainly, as I was the one to give the commitment on behalf of the government when we actually had the debate, it's not about us not accepting the fact that we need a minimum wage. It's about figuring out what the best wage should be to address the issues and concerns that we have. Okay. Now we have that.
We're going to ask you to expand on those additional revelations that have come out of the report as well, Minister Rivers, after we go to headline news. That's going to be for a very, very short break, and then we're going to be back with one more break after that. So we'll probably have at least another 25 minutes of discussions. Please stay tuned. Good morning and welcome back to For the Record. I am your host, Orrit Connor, and my guest in studio with me this morning, we have Premier Honorable Alden McLaughlin. We have Honorable Tara Rivers, Minister responsible for Education, Employment and Gender Affairs. We have Mr. Lemuel Hurlston, who's the chair of the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee, and Ms. Tammy Ebanks, who's the acting Deputy Chief Officer in the ministry, as well as the ministry's liaison with the committee. Before we went to the break, Minister Rivers revealed to us that there were additional revelations that came out of this report as well, and we're going to ask her to share some of those with us.
Well, OC, I mean, we've been talking about some of them, the issue of exploitation, and to the extent that, you know, we now know based on the qualitative data that we've received from the various surveys and focus groups that the committee participated in, that there is real exploitation, there is real abuse at the domestic worker level and in other areas. So that's one of the things that I think that was very beneficial to have, to be able to now have this national dialogue about these type of working conditions, which we know are reprehensible, and certainly not something that I think that, especially now that we know and we have the information to hand, that we must be looking towards making policy decisions, and in this case, including a minimum wage to address. Another issue, I think, or another objective, which we, as a term of reference, asked the committee to look at in their view of determining what should be the best minimum wage regime to adopt, is to the objective 2, which was to improve employment opportunities for Caymanians in relation to decreasing the demand for imported workers. Now, that was an objective that the committee, through their own work and through their deliberations with the guidance of the ILO advisor, determined that the actual minimum wage, the minimum wage regime in and of itself could not address, that there were other things that had to happen in order to really be able to make an impact at that level. Some of those the government had already recognized as well and have put mechanisms in place. So earlier on, the government, even prior to establishing the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee last year, in June, we actually had put together an interministerial committee on employment. Now, again, the Ministry of Employment has employment in title, but a lot of the impacts as it relates to how do we improve employment opportunities go far beyond the ministry itself. And so by having an interministerial committee that brings together ministry representatives from Home Affairs, which is responsible for immigration, ministry representatives from the Community Affairs, which is responsible for the Children and Family Services and the Needs Assessment Unit, and other ministries of transport, which we know one of the issues that seems to be coming forward is people being able to access their places of employment because of lack of transport and otherwise. So there's a number of areas that impact employment and employment opportunities. So the government had already put together this interministerial committee on employment who meet on the regular basis, and we're expecting, hopefully, in due course, a report from that committee. So we're able to see exactly from a very holistic perspective what are the challenges, what are the barriers to Caymanians being able to access and to really thrive in the area of employment and labor. And from there, we can then decide what other policy decisions, what other legislative changes, what other programmatic changes need to be put in place in order to address these concerns. Some of the other aspects or some of the other interesting information which has come out of the report is also a call to the government to look at some of the a further analysis on what's happening at the college-educated unemployed persons, as well as those who are long-term unemployed, and looking at the need to figure out a strategy to, especially those two, because those are the two segments that seem to have the higher incidence of unemployment per segment, so to speak. And so we now have a better idea as to where we should be focusing now our attention in terms of putting together programs or policies to be able to support gainful employment of persons that fall within that college educated or educated bracket, as well as the persons that are long-term unemployed. What are some of those reasons and how do we affect that? And so that's really helping to shape the work of the National Workforce Development Agency in terms of the training programs and whatnot to address some of the long-term unemployed persons that may be out of the market because they don't have the skill set or don't have the experiences to be able to access the jobs of today. And also looking at building closer relationship between the scholarship unit, the scholarship secretariat, and the work of the NWDA too, to ensure that when we send students off to get educated, there is that nexus of, okay, how are we going to continue to support them in employment thereafter? So that in itself is actually caused reinforcement of some of the things that we had already started within the ministry to address, but to have it now come out in an independent assessment conducted by the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee was something that was very interesting. And like I said, it was validation to a large degree as to some of the programs and initiatives which we have already started to take. But some of the things I think that we need to look at as a government, and again goes beyond just the scope of the Ministry of Education, Employment and Gender Affairs, is looking at the policies affecting the minimum wage regime, which would be the poor relief program and some of the immigration policies, which we need to look at to see how, when the government moves to put in place a minimum wage regime, how do these other policies either complement or detract from the effectiveness of the enforcement and the role that a minimum wage would play in the country.
Speaking of the immigration, we know, again, there's anecdotal evidence of that there are still many work permits of conveniences held in the Cayman Islands, where an employer may take out an application for a work permit or take out a work permit for an individual as a domestic helper, domestic engineer, and has only 1, maybe 2 days work for that person. But rather than having that work permit amended to include additional employers, that individual is allowed to go out and work on their own, find additional work. Will that loose policy that is there, or lack of enforcement, it is extremely difficult to enforce, will that have any effect on a minimum wage or any of the recommendations that you have made, Mr. Hurlston?
I don't think so. But of course, the government has already taken steps to augment and supplement the enforcement capabilities of the immigration department, and so the government is mindful of that. We had a representative of immigration serving on our committee, and sadly, immigration has had some other external pressures applied to it in recent times. So we did not have the full participation of the immigration department throughout the entire process. But nevertheless, there will be opportunities for the immigration service to join in the implementation of the relevant sections of this regime. And indeed, what we're hoping will come out of this is not just a good legislative framework, but an enforcement and compliance framework that will be economical to implement, that will be effective in enforcement, and will be cost effective at the end of the day. It's going to take a number of government agencies working in collaboration together in order to make this efficient. We're trying to start it out. We're recommending that it be started out on a very simplistic level. Nothing too complicated, nothing too difficult to understand. There's already in existence an annual return form that companies that have trade and business licenses must submit to the government. We are suggesting, for example, that we could design a simple template that would amend that form, that in addition to all of the other information required for the renewal of a trade and business license, that a certification of compliance with the minimum wage regime can be tacked onto that, so that there's not yet another level of bureaucracy to be navigated. The business community is always pushing back about government over-regulating and over-bureaucratizing the system. So we're hoping that this will be one of the new responsibilities that can be introduced with minimal bureaucracy and minimal compliance requirements.
Now, I know that you don't have any control over the legislative process and the legislative agenda, but as chair of the committee and in the view of your membership, I haven't been able to look in the report to see if you actually recommended a time frame within which this report should be implemented. It's we're riding a wave now. How do we ensure that wave does not end up cresting and nothing being done. Nothing is done.
I think what the Honourable Premier in a statement earlier this year at one of the economic forums at which he was speaking indicated that the government's desire is to have some sort of legislative capacity in place by the end of this year, with a view to possibly rolling out a minimum wage regime sometime early next year. The committee has recommended that whatever the time frame is, that there be allowed a period of 6 months at least between the passage of the legislation and the enforcement part of it, so that the public can adjust to the new requirements and not be seen to be being forced into compliance without due and prior sufficient notice.
Well,
Premier?
let me add to that and say that, as I indicated during the press conference, my aim is to get the caucus to come to a decision about these two key issues, the amount and the start of implementation, over the course of the next few weeks, so that we're in a position to actually make the announcement when the House meets for the budget session. Because that will give, if we do it then, that will give the kind of notice that the chairman just spoke about to the community about when this would actually take effect. I certainly don't want this to be one of those things that is dragging because people are afraid to make decisions. My view is, and the one I will urge on my caucus, is that let's take a decision and let's make the announcement and get started with whatever legislative changes or amendments that are necessary to give effect to this.
Mr. Rivers, you want to add to that?
I do, and I just, as I said, I mean, we have a document, we have a report that now has indicated a number of, very thought out, well reasoned facts and statistics and probabilities based on the assumptions that they've made. We also know that we certainly, as I said, this was something that the government, through, as I said myself, when I spoke on behalf of the government on this issue, when we were asked to accept, the government was always minded to look at the issue of what people are being paid and how are they living. Now we have gotten a document that helps us to be able to make that determination. It would be remiss of the government to just sit on it. And I certainly would be also urging my colleagues to look very closely at the report, look at what the implications would be, look at what the requirements would be for enforcement. And as Chairman Lem has said, I've asked and we've tasked them to come up with recommendations which would be implementable, which would have the minimal impact on the regime that we have now, but which we know that can be enforced. And I just want to touch on the issue of enforcement. Again, an area that falls within the ministry of that being pensions. And I know historically we've had issues with respect to pensions enforcement. So what the government, through recommendations of myself at caucus and what we've actually done in terms of legislation, we've got a new trade and business licensing law, which makes it a requirement now for companies to show that they are compliant with pensions, to show that they are compliant with health insurance in order to be able to get such licenses. So that's how, again, looking at a problem, an age-old problem, and trying to find a solution that is as easily accessible as possible. And so the recommendation of now just adding an additional reporting requirement to your trade and business licensing regime sounds sensible to me from my perspective, because we have already now asked the business community to do that with respect to, are they compliant with pensions? Are they compliant with health insurance? So that's one way that we have addressed the issue of lack of enforcement of these two areas, and looking at it from a perspective that is a requirement from the business side. To be able to get your license, you do need to be compliant.
Okay. We have one caller online. We're going to take that caller now. Caller, good morning and welcome to For the Record.
Yes, good morning, Mr. O'Connor.
Good morning. How are you?
Okay, and good morning to Honorable Premier.
Morning, sir.
Good morning, Minister Rivers,
Good morning.
Mr. Tommy,
Morning.
Banks, and Mr. Hurlston.
Good morning.
Yes, it's good that we have a minimum wage in place.
Not
Not in
quite.
place yet,
Not quite.
but
You got a
on
report.
its way.
a recommendation.
Okay. And I think what we have to look at, $6 an hour. When it comes to getting a mortgage on a house, $6 an hour, working regular hours, is not enough. People would actually have to work 16-hour shifts for $6 an hour in order to make enough money to have a savings in order to go to the bank to get a mortgage to buy a home.
But that's really not the intention of the the recommendation or the legislation.
Okay? And also, $6 an hour is not enough when it comes to having less people being a burden on social services. Thank you.
But you, caller, are you still there?
No, he gone.
Okay. Because he has to recognize that there has to be incremental steps in this. You can't just jump, like you explained earlier, to one particular area. Ms. Susan, you want to take the break now, and then we're going to take a break now, and then we're going to give everyone an opportunity in less than 10 minutes to wrap up. Folks, please stay tuned. We're going to be back very shortly. Good morning and welcome back to For the Record. We're going to go straight to the phone lines. Looks like we're going to probably go over a little bit this morning, Miss Susan. Caller, good morning and welcome to For the Record.
Good morning, everybody. This is number one from the bracket, extra special to the lady or ladies.
Morning.
Good morning.
Morning, sir.
Will you please tell Radio Kim and make the show go on at 10 o'clock?
You really think I got a lot of power, don't you?
What are you in the premiere for? Look, young man, this is not a rock of I'm talking to. Listen, I just want to ask a question. When you're talking about this minimum wage, that is just for people that is doing something under $3 or $4 an hour, right? That's not regular paid people like in big jobs.
Right. It's going to affect people who are earning the lowest wages in Cayman. Yes. Yeah.
But that is what I'm wondering. What is all the big fuss that other people carrying on about? If somebody working and they're making only $4 and they can't pay for the rent and you give them $6, fine. But why talk about bank loans and different things, not getting when you're only making a couple dollars? I don't understand that.
I think you hit the nail on the head, sir.
Right on the head.
Anyway, keep up with the good work. I'll listen to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, number one. We're going to go around the table. We're going to start with Mr. Hurston for final comments.
Thank you very much, OC. Thank you for having us. And I too would like to say thanks to the members of the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee, beginning with the Deputy Chair, Nick Joseph, and all the members representing employers and employees. We worked on this project for 9 months, and when I posted the report on my Facebook page last week, I said the baby has been delivered after 9 months. So that's the history of it. We do sincerely hope that it will be seen as a faithful attempt to meet the terms of reference and the mandate from the government. We had to go through the process and feel the pain in order to get there, but we got there, and the result speaks for itself. It's a thorough report. Some people say unnecessarily thorough, but it is what it is. And once we have tendered our advice, that's as much as we could be expected to do. It is advisory, and we have done exactly that.
Thank you very much. And, for those who complain about being unnecessarily thorough, if it weren't, then they would go the opposite direction and say not thorough enough. Ms. Tammy?
Right. I would echo the chair's comments and just thanks everyone for this process. It's been a learning experience, to say the least. I would like to thank also the businesses and persons who took the time out to provide us with the information that we needed to make this report possible. I also wanted to just add a little thing as far as legislation and moving forward that was kind of missed in the discussion in the last round, and that is one of the recommendations of the committee was that in legislation it was recommended that the minimum wage is examined by a technical expert once every year and by a future minimum wage advisory committee every 4 years, because we found in our discussions that you can implement a minimum wage and then sometimes it just sits for years and years without it being looked at and becomes ineffective. So that's one of the recommendations of the committee as well, as far as moving forward in legislation. If persons have not been able to get in the minimum wage report, it is available on the ministry's website. It's education.gov.ky/minimum wage. It's available there to download, as well as the chair's statements were available, which is a more condensed version of the main recommendations and information in the report. And if persons have comments to say on the report, feel free to email us at minimumwage@gov.ky.
Okay, we're going to go to Minister next. I'm going to leave the Premier for the last, simply because not only in the hierarchy of things, but I don't think management is going to limit us to the 9:30 hour if the Premier has to speak last. So, Minister Rivers.
Fair strategic decision there. I too, again, I just want to reiterate my heartfelt thanks to the committee, to the members of the ministry, and all of the other ex officio members from representing other government departments that was a part of this process. It was something that, when I did convene the committee and had the first meeting, I recognize what we asked of them in terms of the extensiveness of the kinds of information, the questions that we asked, the extensiveness of the information that I knew that they would have to gather and then analyze and put together in such a comprehensive manner. To do so in 9 months was a very ambitious task, irrespective of what other people think about, doing such a process. Having had some experience in doing empirical research and analysis myself in my prior life to politics, I know exactly how daunting the task must have seemed at the time. So I do want to say a big thank you from the bottom of my heart with respect to all the work that has gone in, and you have been true to yourselves. You have been true to the best of your ability to the terms of reference set to you. I also want to say that, it does give me great pride as the Minister responsible for Labour to be able to assist this government and to assist this country in getting to this point, to be able for us now to have the kind of information that we need to have in order to make a decision. And I will continue to urge my colleagues to take that next step and make a decision to move us forward with having a minimum wage regime that is implementable, that is well thought out, that is reasoned, and something that we can start with. As we said, this is a figure, obviously, that some people agree with, some people won't agree with. That is just the way democracy works. But in terms of the process has been true to processes that have happened around the world. In the UK, when they re-established theirs in 1998, they also took a conservative approach to the number, because we have to recognize the balancing act. With life, there's everything. There's the yin and then there's the yang to any decision taken. And I think the committee has done a tremendous job in weighing those balances. And now caucus and government and cabinet will also have to take a decision that balances the needs and the wants and the desires of the community and as us as a government. But at this point, I think I'm extremely proud to say that we have come a long way. And to get us to that next step is that much closer. And I want to thank the members of the Minimum Wage Advisory Committee for making my job as Minister of Labour that much easier now that I can make the recommendation moving forward.
Thank you, Minister. Premier, the last word.
Thank you very much. I want to start by thanking, again, although I did so at the press conference, the chairman, Mr. Lemuel Hurlston, and all members of the committee for the very careful, well thought out report and the hard work that I know went into doing it. And while the cynical among us will say the report is too thorough, if you're going to err, that's the side I want you to err on. Give me too much information rather than not enough information on which to be able to base the decisions that I have to take. I am never been one who believes in flying by the seat of my pants. I like to have before me the information which I think is necessary to be able to make the key decisions. But once, and those who know me will know that, but once I have that information and I've thought the matter through, I really don't have much reservation in making the decisions regardless of how difficult they may be. I don't like to have things hanging, and I say that because I am really going to press for us to make a decision quickly about the way forward with respect to this report and be able to make an announcement to the country, as I said, hopefully sometime next month. I believe that those who have reservations, and some have already spoken to me, some of my constituents, and we've heard some of it voiced this morning about the number 6 being too low. I believe that we do need to proceed with some caution, that the number isn't carved in stone, that it is capable of being reviewed in a very relatively short order, that we do have to bear in mind the balancing exercise which the minister spoke about, and we have to be careful about how we impact an economy which is still really in the stages of recovery. But I do believe that this is a first crucial step down the road of social justice in this country. You know, Cayman has been a society in transition for a long time, and we have actually more people on work permits than there are other people in the workforce, and those things create all sorts of different social situations and conditions. And unfortunately, one of its consequences has been a great deal of social injustice. And any forward-thinking Christian society must consider the interest of those who are most vulnerable amongst us. So I don't want people, as Mr. Bryan was suggesting, to think about this in terms of Caymanian and non-Caymanian. We are all human beings living and working in one country, and it is important that we treat people like people, humanely. So I want to thank you, OC, for doing your usual good job of hosting the morning show, and I do hope that we have collectively managed to impart significant new information and clarify some issues which or concerns which people may have had as a result of today.
Okay.
And thank you all very much, and I wish you and all within the sound of my voice a wonderful day and a wonderful week.
Okay. I want to thank you all as well, for being on For the Record this morning. I also want to thank our listening audience for allowing us into their homes, into their vehicles as they traverse the roads of the Cayman Islands, either going to work or elsewhere, and those of you who are able to listen in your workplace as well. I want to remind all of you, all of us, that we are our brothers and our sisters' keepers. There's always someone out there who's less fortunate than we are, and I ask you to extend a helping hand to them. If you can't, then you should donate to a worthy charity. I say to you employers out there, those of you who are already paying persons well above the minimum wage, continue to do so. And for those of you who aren't and who can afford to, certainly, do so without having to be prodded by legislation. When you do that, you will find that you have more honest employees, more dedicated employees, because if they feel that they're being properly remunerated for the work that they do, then they're going to be more dedicated to your company or to whatever employer they're in with you. I also want to echo what the Minister Rivers, has said in terms of that we really want to think about those who need and not about those who want. And with those words, I say to you, thanks for listening to Radio Cayman.